Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for the opportunity to be a part of this special centennial year's commencement at Oklahoma State University. Governors are called upon to do a lot of unnecessary things. But I can't think of anything I've ever been called upon to do that's less necessary than what I'm about to do now. Is there anyone here who doesn't know the President of the United States? If any of you graduates don't know, you're going to flunk, I can assure you. The great state of Oklahoma, and by the way, it isn't President Bush anymore, it's Dr. Bush. We are very proud to see that he has an honorary degree from this great university. The great state of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University are singularly honored today by hosting a fellow Southwesterner who's been in our state many times, but never before as President of the United States. So welcome back, Mr. President. I might say to you folks, if you'd been with us in Tulsa just now, this event would take on even greater meaning, because just the logistics and the organizational activity that go with a presidential visit are absolutely astounding. This university is one of the select few that will be honored with a presidential visit this spring, and we should feel particularly flattered that the President chose to favor us with this visit. George Bush was Oklahoma's choice on Super Tuesday and again on November 8, 1988. So, Mr. President, I want to remind you, you're among friends. You might say this is kindler and gentler country. So now, members of the class of 1990, parents, faculty, staff, fellow Aggies, fellow Oklahomans, I have the great personal privilege and the high honor to present the President of the United States, the Honorable George Bush.
Thank you all very much. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you, Governor Bellman, my longtime friend, and President Campbell, you, sir, for your wonderful hospitality, and to Senator Don Nichols, my collaborator and colleague up in Washington, D.C., Congressman Wes Watkins, another graduate of this great institution, Bellman 42, Nichols 71, Watkins 60. I am delighted to be with these three distinguished public servants. I want to congratulate Chief Wilma Mankiller and Mr. Donnelly, the recipients of the coveted Bennett Awards, and say how proud I am of them, and salute the regents, the administrators, the faculty, the parents, Liz Taylor, right here, and most of all, OSU's centennial graduating class. Congratulations to each and every single one of you. I'm sorry Barbara couldn't be with me here. She did tell me to get a beer and some cheese fries over at Eskimo Joe's. And hoping at the same time they have enough T-shirts for all the grandchildren. You know, when graduates of my vintage were sitting through ceremonies like this right after the Second World War, we faced a world of changes, full of potential and new possibilities. And Barbara and I got into a red two-door Studebaker. You still drive those, don't you, around here? But nevertheless, and we drove from Connecticut down to West Texas. I've often wondered how far I'd gone if I'd made it on up to Oklahoma. Post-war America was ready back then in 1948 for peace and prosperity, But while the free world was recovering, the nations of Eastern Europe were being consolidated behind an iron curtain. And so began 4 decades of division in Europe, 40 long years of suspicion between 2 superpowers, Soviet Union and the United States. And today, you also graduate at an end of an era of conflict, but a contest of a different kind, a cold and abstract war of words and walls. And now Europe and the world have entered a new era, the age of freedom. And I hope you'll forgive me if I use this great forum at your great university to handle a subject of a very serious nature. It may be a little longer than you want to hear. I remember the graduate at Yale University, my school, the man grabbing the graduate speech got up and he said, Y is for youth, and he talked about 25 minutes. A is for altruism, another 32 minutes. L is loyalty, he brushed that one off in 20 minutes. E is for excellence. And when he finished, there was one kid out here in the audience, everyone else had fled. And he looked like he was praying, and the speaker said to him, well, I'm glad you're saying a prayer. What are you praying for, son? He said, I'm praying to God and giving thanks that you didn't go to Oklahoma State University. So but I want you to bear with me, because I'll be reflecting on the power and potential of democratic changes in several of these commencement addresses that I make this year. And I begin today, my very first at your great university, with a few words on the changes in America's place in a new Europe. A few of you may be wondering what a continent 4,000 miles away has to do with your class and you. Throughout our history, great upheavals in Europe have forced the American people to respond, to make deep judgments about the part we should play in European affairs. This has been true from the time of the French Revolution and the wars which followed it to World War I, and the flawed peace which ended it, on to the Second World War and the creation of post-war order. And I believe that now we are poised at another such moment, a critical time in our strategic relationship with our neighbors across the Atlantic. Many of the graduates of America's class of 1916 have wondered why the faraway war making headlines in their newspapers would have anything to do with them. And they might have agreed with President Wilson, who that year said, "We are not interested in the causes of war, in the obscure foundations from which its stupendous flood has burst forth." But a year later, those classmates and their country were swept up in the torrent, carrying them to the horror of the trenches in France. And yet after the war, we again turned away from active involvement in European affairs. And instead, we sponsored a treaty to outlaw war. And then, as the outlaws gained strength, the United States passed new neutrality laws. Another generation of Americans sat in the bright sun of commencement ceremonies at colleges all across our country, thinking war in Europe would somehow pass them by. But when war came, they paid an awful price, a horrible price for America's isolation. And then when the war ended, those students who no longer questioned our role in the future of Europe, they no longer asked what Europe had to do with them, because they knew the answer: everything. About a year ago in Germany, I defined the kind of Europe our country is committed to: a peaceful, stable Europe, a Europe what I call whole and free. Today, that goal is within our reach. We're entering a new age of freedom in a time of uncertainty, but great hope. Emerging democracies in Eastern Europe are going through social, political, and economic transformations, shaking loose stagnant, centralized bureaucracies that have smothered initiative for generations. And in this time of transition, moving away from the post-war era and beyond containment, we cannot know what choices the people of Eastern Europe will make for their future. The process of change in the Soviet Union is also still unfinished, and it'll be crucial to see, for example, whether Moscow chooses coercion or peaceful dialogue in responding to the aspirations of the Lithuanian people and nationalities within the Soviet Union. The only noble answer lies in a dialogue that results in unencumbered self-determination for Lithuania. President Gorbachev has made profound progress in his country, reforms so fundamental that the clock cannot be turned back, and yet neither can we turn the clock ahead to know for sure what kind of country the Soviet Union will be in years to come. And for the sake of the future we share with Europe, our policies and presence must be appropriate for this period of transition, with a constancy and reliability that will reassure our friends, both old and new. My European colleagues want the United States to be a part of Europe's future, and I believe they're right. The United States should remain a European power in the broadest sense, politically, militarily, economically, and as part of our global responsibilities, the foundation for America's peaceful engagement in Europe has been and will continue to be NATO. Recognizing in peace what we'd learned from war, we joined with the free nations of Europe to form an Atlantic community, an enduring political compact. Our engagement in Europe has meant that Europeans accept America as part of their continent's future, taking our interest into account across the board. Our commitment is not just in defense. It must be a well-balanced mix of involvement in all dimensions of European affairs. Because of our political commitment to peace in Europe, there hasn't been a war on the continent in 45 years. Think of your history books. Not a war on the continent in 45 years. This long peace should be viewed through the long lens of history then. Europe has now experienced the longest uninterrupted period of international peace in the recorded history of that continent. Now, the alliance is now ready to build on that historic achievement and define its objectives for the next century. So the alliance must join together to craft a new Western strategy for new and changing times. Having consulted intensively with Prime Minister Thatcher recently there in Bermuda, and President Mitterrand in Key Largo in Florida, and Chancellor Helmut Kohl up in Camp David, and then by telephone or cable with NATO Secretary General Werner and all of my other allied colleagues, I am now calling for an early summit of all NATO leaders. Margaret Thatcher, one of freedom's greatest champions of the last decade, told me that while NATO has been fantastically successful, we should be ready now to face new challenges. The time is right for the alliance to act. The fundamental purpose of this summit should be to launch a wide-ranging NATO strategy review for the transformed Europe of the 1990s. And to my NATO colleagues, I suggest that our summit direct this review by addressing 4 critical points. 1, the political role that NATO can play in Europe. 2, the conventional forces the alliance will need in the time ahead and NATO's goal for conventional arms control. 3, the role of nuclear weapons based in Europe and Western objectives in new nuclear arms control negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And 4, strengthening the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, to reinforce NATO and help protect democratic values in a Europe that is whole and free. Now, the first task the NATO summit should consider is the future political mission of the alliance. As military threats fade, the political dimension of NATO's work, always there but seldom noticed, becomes prominent. And so, at the NATO summit, we should look for ways to help our German friends sustain freedom and achieve German unity, something which we and our allies have supported for over 40 years. And we should reaffirm the importance of keeping a united Germany as a full member of NATO. The alliance needs to find ways to work more closely with a vigorous European community that is rightly asserting its own distinct views. And in Eastern Europe, governments, once our adversaries, are now our partners in building a new continent. And so we must also talk about how to encourage further peaceful democratic change in Eastern Europe and inside the Soviet Union. But even as NATO gives more emphasis to its political mission, its guarantee of European security must remain firm. You see, our enemy today, if you think about it, what's the enemy today? Our enemy today is uncertainty and instability. And so, the alliance will need to maintain a sound, collective military structure with forces in the field backed by larger forces that can be called upon in some crisis. And which brings me then to the second task for the NATO summit, a review of how the alliance should plan its conventional defenses. While we need to recognize that it will take some time before the Soviet military presence is gone from Eastern Europe, before those Soviet troops are taken out of Eastern Europe, and before the major reductions contemplated by both sides can be implemented, we need to develop our strategy for that world now. Obviously, as I look at the equation, Soviet actions, what the Russians do, will be critical. And yet, even after all the planned reductions in its forces are complete, even if our current arms control proposals are agreed and implemented, the Soviet military will still field forces dwarfing those of any other single European state, armed with thousands of nuclear weapons. Militarily significant U.S. forces must remain on the other side of the Atlantic for as long as our allies want and need them. And these forces demonstrate, as no words can, the enduring political compact that binds America's fate with Europe's democracies. If the Soviet withdrawal continues and our arms control efforts are successful, we must plan for a different kind of military presence, focused less on the danger of an immediate outbreak of war, and we must promote long-term stability and prevent crises from escalating by relying on reduced forces that show our capability and our readiness to respond to whatever may arise. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, which we have proposed, would be the most ambitious conventional arms control agreement ever concluded. And we must finish the work on this treaty soon and plan to sign it at the CSCE summit this fall. But at the NATO summit, we need to look further ahead, preparing follow-on negotiations after the conclusion of the CFE treaty. And the NATO summit should develop the alliance's objectives for these talks. And third, the NATO summit should also assess the future of U.S. nuclear forces in Europe. As democracy blooms in Eastern Europe, and as Soviet troops return home and tanks are destroyed, dismantled, there is less need for nuclear systems of the shortest range. And the NATO summit should accelerate ongoing work within the alliance to determine the minimum number of and types of weapons that will be needed to deter war credibly and effectively. In light of these new political conditions and the limited range and flexibility of these short-range nuclear missile forces based in Europe, I've reviewed our plan to produce and deploy newer, more modern short-range nuclear missiles to replace the Lance system that's now in Europe. And we've almost finished the R&D, research and development work for these new missiles. But I've decided, after consultation with our allies, to terminate the follow-on to Lance program. I've also decided to cancel any further modernization of U.S. nuclear artillery shells deployed in Europe. Now there are still short-range U.S. and many more Soviet nuclear missile systems deployed in Europe, and we're prepared to negotiate the reduction of these forces as well as a set of new set of arms control talks. And at the NATO Summit, I will urge my colleagues to agree on the broad objectives for these future U.S.-Soviet negotiations and begin preparations within the alliance for these talks. I would also like to suggest that these new U.S.-Soviet arms control talks begin shortly after this CFE Treaty on Conventional Forces has been signed. And in taking these steps, the United States is not going to allow Europe to become safe for conventional war. There are a few lessons so clear in history as this. Only the combination of conventional forces and nuclear forces have ensured this long peace in Europe. But every aspect of America's engagement in Europe, military, political, economic, must be complementary. And one place where they all come together is in the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, an organization of 35 states of Europe and North America. The CSCE is already a beacon for human rights and individual freedoms, and now it must take on a broader role. And so the fourth task for this NATO summit I'm calling for is to reach common allied objectives for the future of CSCE itself. It can help the victorious forces of democracy in Eastern Europe secure their revolutions, and as they join the Commonwealth of Free Nations, be assured a voice in a new Europe. And the CSCE should offer new guidelines for building free societies, including setting standards for truly free elections, adopting measures to strengthen the rule of law, and pointing the way in the needed but painful transition from centralized command economies to the free markets. The CSCE can also provide a forum for political dialogue in a more united Europe. And I agree with those who have called for regular consultations among senior representatives of the CSCE countries. We should consider whether new CSCE mechanisms can help mediate and settle disputes in Europe. And I believe my allied colleagues and I should agree to take up these new ideas at a CSCE summit later this year in conjunction with the signing of the treaty I talked to you about, that Conventional Force Treaty, the CFE Treaty. In Eastern Europe, in this hemisphere, the triumph of democracy has cast its warm light on the face of the world like a miraculous dawn. But the outcome of this struggle for freedom is not ordained, and it's not going to be the work of miracles. All of you who graduate here today are part of a historic decision for America's engagement in the future of Europe. And I am convinced that our work to protect freedom, to build free societies, will safeguard our own peace and prosperity. The security of Europe and the world has become very complex in this century, but America's commitment to stability and peace is profoundly clear. And its motivation really derives from the strength of our forefathers, from the blood of those who have died for freedom, and for the sake of all who live in peace. And as you leave this great university, Every voice, every heart's commitment to freedom is important. There's a story about a man trying to convince his son that in the struggle for freedom, every voice counts. And they stood in a valley watching the snow fall on a distant mountain. Might have been a day like today. And, but they stood there. "Tell me the weight of a snowflake," the man said. "Almost nothing," answered the boy. And as the snow swirled around them, up on the mountain they saw an avalanche whose thunder shook the earth. "Do you know which snowflake caused that?" the old man asked. "I don't," answered the boy. "Maybe," said the man, "like the last snowflake that moves a mountain. In the struggle for freedom, a single voice makes a world of difference. America's mission in Europe, like millions of individual decisions made for freedom, can make a voice, can make a world of difference. The cry for freedom in Eastern Europe, and in South Africa, and right here in our precious hemisphere to our south, was heard around the world in the revolution of 1989. And today, in this new age of freedom, add your voices to the thundering chorus. It's a great honor for me to have been at this university. Thank you very much. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you.